and welcome to the August 22nd regular meeting of the City of Troy Planning Commission. Copies of the agenda for tonight's meeting are available at the entrance to the room, and agendas and minutes of prior meetings are available on the city website. The meeting will be conducted in accordance with the agenda as presented or amended by the Planning Commission.
State law establishes planning commissions. This planning commission is comprised of 9 residents appointed to serve our community. Members are appointed by the mayor and confirmed by city council. Other individuals participating in the meeting include representatives of the city's planning department and the city's attorney's office.
All right, there's nobody here from the public yet, but if they do show up, if they wish to address the Planning Commission, they can come forward to the microphone, and when recognized, they can clearly print their name and address on the sign-in sheet, and please begin their remarks by stating their name for the benefit of the commissioners. All remarks are to be addressed to the Planning Commission, not to anyone else in the room. If anyone has a cell phone or any other device that might disrupt the meeting, please either switch it to the silent mode or turn it off. And at this time, I'll ask our Planning Commission Recording Secretary Kathy Zarnicki to conduct the roll call.
Mr. Buechner?
Here.
Mr. Faison?
Here.
Mr. Fox?
Here.
Mr. Hudson?
Here.
Mr. Krent?
Here.
Mr. Lambert?
Here.
Ms. Malala-Holly? Here. Ms. Parakis?
Here.
Mr. Tagle?
Here.
Quorum present, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Would someone like to make a motion to approve the agenda?
Sure.
Mr. Fox moves, Mr. Krent seconds it. Any discussion on the agenda? Seeing none, we're ready for the roll call.
Mr. Faison?
Yes.
Mr. Fox?
Yes.
Mr. Hudson?
Yes.
Mr. Krent?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes.
Ms. Malala-Holly?
Yes.
Ms. Parakis?
Yes.
Mr. Tagle?
Yes.
Mr. Buechner?
Yes.
Motion carries.
And next is approval of minutes from the August 8th meeting. Would someone like to move to approve those minutes?
Sure.
Ms. Parekis and Mr. Buechner seconds it. So any discussion on approving the minutes? All right, we're ready for the roll call.
Mr. Fox?
Yes.
Mr. Hudson?
Yes.
Mr. Krent?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes.
Ms. Malala-Holly?
Yes.
Ms. Parakis?
Yes.
Mr. Tagle?
Yes.
Mr. Buechner?
Yes.
Mr. Faison?
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right. And next is public comment for items not on the agenda, but no one is here from the public, so we can move quickly along to Mr. Sabaton, I assume, for our presentation on Neighboring Community Sustainability Report.
I'm going to kick it off and I'm going to hand it off. So,
That sounds good.
yeah, so June 27th, Planning Commission regular meeting. The Planning Commission passed a resolution. It's on the screen. The resolution reads, to request city staff to formally draft a report of ordinance changes implemented in the neighboring communities to specifically require or incentivize developers to implement low-impact development or other forms of green building, including but not limited to the installation of power installations that utilize green energy. It's requested that this report be presented to the Planning Commission no later than the second meeting of August 2023, which is tonight. And what we recognize before this is just kind of introducing the project here. The first thing we did was kind of try to define exactly what this says. It's a little bit wordy, and I know it was crafted at the table a little bit based on some feedback. So the report gets into it a little bit, but we believe the intent was that identifying sustainable elements that communities apply, specifically in the zoning ordinance. And we define sustainable as employing products or methods that seek to minimize the impact of development on the natural environment. That was what we understood as being the scope of the project. And the communities that we researched besides Troy were neighboring communities that basically border Troy. Some of them border like on a pinprick intersection, but they're Auburn Hills, Rochester Hills, Shelby Township, Sterling Heights, Madison Heights, Royal Oak, Clawson, Birmingham, and Bloomfield Township. So with that, as I told you on June 27th, I was going to task Salim Huerta Jr. with this project. Salim goes by Salim or JR. He is works in the planning department. His title is Commercial Project Collaborator. I got it right. Kind of wears a lot of different hats. He works in the building department and kind of in the planning department at this concurrently. Very valuable member of our team. He's going to graduate school at Wayne State University for a master's in planning. So he wants my job, is what I'm trying to say. And someday I'll have him for sure. He's awesome. But with that, I just suggested to Salim just kind of walk us through it, and this is a really great environment for talking and discussing, and away you go.
Yeah, so just first for clarification, Tom had emailed me asking what the blue was. That was, so in terms of the filter I have on my screen, I couldn't actually tell the color difference. So blue is green, and I can clarify the intent of the legend for the chart. So red is required. It means there's an explicit exaction within the ordinance that defines a requirement for that specific best management practice. Green means it's permitted. It means it's either implicitly mentioned, or there's a general topic that would cover that subtopic of that best managing practice. Yellow means it's incentivized, which really is ideal, because most of the time, if something may be permitted, it may be mentioned, and it may not even be included in the ordinance, which is the intent of the blank category. There's a lot of municipalities that are implementing a lot of these best managing practices, and they do not include it in their ordinance. A really good example is Auburn Hills. You can search through the entire ordinance, you won't find any of these best managing practices, but they actually do very well on many of them, and they provide a lot of alternative resources outside of the ordinance for applicants, contractors, and architects. Just going through it, you can see there's some general trends within the best managing practices. Some, for example, cluster developments that are more often incentivized for, there's some that we've included kind of beyond the scope of the low impact development manual that's provided by SEMCOG. That is kind of in that last chart, the other best management practices, which are pretty typical standard required best management practices, but or they're used, but they may not be explicitly defined. Whereas in terms of the first and second chart, those are taken straight from that manual, and they're, as they've defined it, either a structural or non-structural best management practice.
Does everyone understand the best management practices in the far left column?
Give us some explanation.
Yeah. So these can all be pretty technical. They involve engineers, civil engineers, architects, and local municipalities to review these designs. So I wouldn't say I'm an expert on them, and even people that are experts may not be experts in all of these systems. So they're not necessarily straightforward, but I do have some primary definitions, and then I thought what would be useful would be for me to pull up the low impact development manual itself.
Is it on the
And
abstract?
it has images that will help kind of clarify each of these on top of the definitions that were provided. It's on the S drive, and yeah.
I didn't know what a riparian buffer
Yeah, I was
is.
gonna say, that
Yeah.
was one word that threw me.
No.
There were a couple.
Riparian refers to the area surrounding a waterway or any kind of natural water flow. So there's vegetation that is surrounding that acts as a buffer, and that's the riparian buffer, riparian feature. So a lot of times revegetation efforts or buffer efforts will include that because it helps filter water runoff into those waterways.
Can you guys all see? Do I need to move?
I can see fine.
Chair, is it in the
Am I
planning
blocking you
commission?
guys at all? Can you see this?
2023 meetings?
John, can you see it? You can slide over.
Oh, I guess
You want to switch?
oh, something else, okay.
Just give us a second, we'll pull it up.
I had it on this computer, but I realized that one is
Oh, there we go.
Are you trying to say you're retiring sometime soon?
Hopefully one
Should
day.
we slide that chair?
Sure, you want to switch?
Yeah.
So Salim, I had a quick question for you. I know this is as a point in time, but I was just wondering if there's momentum towards these type of requirements in cities around here or cities in general.
This manual was initially actually generated at the federal level based off of best practices at military level in 2009. So since then, there has been an effort to implement them, especially in Michigan, given the environmental resources that we have to protect natural water resources. So I would say that
So we're
It's-
implementing the 2009
this
plan.
this manual from 2009 is kind of like the the Bible
The
of low
foundational
impact
document.
development.
Okay.
And the main distinction we wanted to make was the differentiation between low impact development practices and green building practices. Because one thing that's unique for zoning is the intersection between infrastructure that may be considered structural, for example, EV infrastructure, and best managing practices that are environmentally friendly, that where we have more control over, which is low impact development. So I'll just actually go through some of the features here.
Can I just ask you a quick
Yeah.
question?
Do you want me to grab a mouse? Are you cool?
I'm good with this.
Okay.
So I understand about the chart and the presentation that you provided to us, but what about the, I was also hoping that I'm going to see something along the lines of the newer ways of constructing a residential or a commercial complex. I was also, maybe I was thinking wrong, so correct me if I was thinking wrong, but I was thinking on those lines too. Was I wrong in thinking? Do we have separate?
It's not wrong. I guess it determines on how you define construction. So the prepping and design of a site, access to a site, that's also part of the construction process, which if you mean structurally, I can go over a portion of the actual report that kind of helps clarify that a little bit. And it's kind of a general misconception in terms of the definition of these three terms. They're not exactly interchangeable. Green building generally goes above and beyond the minimum life safety requirements of the Michigan Building and Michigan Residential Code, and zoning has no jurisdiction in terms of imposing stricter requirements on that. That includes things like energy producing systems. Although I do have an area here which may be of interest what you're referring to, which are elements of green building. There's standards of green building at international level, International Green Building Code, which is not typically adopted in Michigan. But there are processes where you could potentially create incentives to have features of those codes implemented, but it's something that would necessarily need to be voluntary by the applicant or contractor or architect, because we cannot impose stricter requirements that are what determined by experts at the Michigan state level.
That makes sense. Thank you for the clarification.
Yep, so just, I guess we could go over these real quick. So there's energy efficiency, which can go from kind of the typical green construction, green roof, insulation, which the standards, and if you're interested in terms of the building code level, I'm also registered as a building code official, so I have that kind of experience in terms of voting for things like that. There is a general increase in that trend, requiring stricter ratings for insulation, things like that, energy compliance methods and things. So, but overall, at a commercial level, that would lead up to good interactive building technologies, which are kind of like more the leading edge of the future of, which basically has to do with responsive energy capacities between what's existing in the building and the grid itself. And I don't have the data here, but there's indicators that that's much more efficient than trying to make the building itself more energy efficient, which is kind of just a feature thing. So there's water efficiency, sustainable materials, indoor environmental quality, renewable energy, building envelope design, which has to do with energy efficiency, building automation. 100 East Big Beaver is an example of a building that has a very sophisticated building automation system in terms of their internal energy, like saying lighting, sensors, heating, cooling, sustainable construction practices, which is more where we would have more control over in terms of zoning compliance, life cycle construction, which we have some ability to affect in terms of reusability of buildings, which has to do with compliance with zoning districts, but also the flexibility within that. And lastly, what gets a little bit confused with green building and low impact design is LEED, because LEED, and BREEAM is kind of like the English grandfather of LEED, but LEED is like the standard program that implements both and then gives you a rating, and then that helps to promote both practices essentially.
But that's also a voluntary program and an
Yeah.
expensive program.
Yeah, and generally, these items have to have some form of incentivization, which is why that's the most effective way to implement them in an ordinance compared to just permitting them or allowing them and not mentioning them or even requiring them.
I'm gathering, and correct me if I'm gathering on the wrong spot, but what we just went through are mainly controlled by construction ordinances, or at least requirements of the city. So, if we were to do something, let's say in the zoning area, that's going to be impacted by whether or not it's required by the structural part.
Yeah, part of the definition is that we cannot place stricter requirements that are required. We can place incentives for stricter requirements, but we cannot require them.
Okay, yeah.
Mr. Savidant, is there an example that that you can say in the past that Tri-City has done where we have incentivized the developers towards going in this direction?
Regarding the list that JR just had on the
Any of
screen,
those?
can you go to that list again?
Any of those or some of those or all?
Yes, for sure. Now you can go down.
The Cresby or?
No, the sustainable development.
Okay, thanks.
So there's this sustainable development project option that Troy's the only city that I'm aware of that has this type of project. A sustainable development project is defined in, we have some standards in a document, and it's referred to in the zoning ordinance in multiple districts. What it is, it's an optional program that's available for developers when it's spelled out in the zoning ordinance. What we see most of is in the IB district, you're not allowed to park in the front yard. There's no parking between the building and the street, unless you get a variance, which most people don't want to go before the ZBA for a variance, or unless you're a sustainable development project. And if you're a sustainable development project, you have to meet certain criteria for approval. So basically, the additional impervious surface of the parking spaces in front of the building, you have to design that in such a way that it doesn't add additional impact onto the stormwater, the groundwater, the stormwater system. And you do that by, perhaps, there's different ways to do it, but one way you could do it is you could propose a pervious parking surface where when it rains, it goes directly, it doesn't flow off, it goes directly into the ground. Or you could, it could be designed in such a way that it's slightly angled, so when it rains, it sheet flows into a rain garden or a bioswale, and that's like a mini detention basin that treats the water on site. That's probably the most common one. The SDP committee is comprised of 5 people. It's comprised of the planning director, the city engineer, the city building official, and 2 members of planning commission. And right now, they're Mr. Tagle, Mr. Hudson. If you remember, a few months ago, I sent an email around asking if anyone else wanted to participate, and I have to get to that because it might be. I think it's healthy to turn over the committee so everyone serves for a couple of years, so that everyone gets exposure to it. But it's a really great committee. I think Mr. Hudson and Mr. Tagle would agree. I mean, feel free to chime in on this. We see some cool projects.
O'Brien Construction, one of our first projects up there, for their parking in the rain garden.
Yeah, so there's a menu of different things that you can propose. O'Brien really went over the top, but they did the rain garden where sheet flows in, that you see an EV charging station. They did LED low impact lights. They put a shower inside for people who like to work or exercise and
Shower's the opposite of green.
Well,
It encourages you to ride your bike.
it encourages you to
Yeah.
ride your bike instead of drive a car.
When I had a shower in one of my buildings, the city wanted to charge me $80,000 for the shower because it wasn't.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
2 buildings that I bought that had showers in them that I had to remove because they're not. The
Yeah.
opposite of green is what I was told. I removed
Wow.
them because I couldn't afford $80,000.
Yeah. But I looked at all the projects. We've done a lot of projects. I think there's been
Right.
around
Makes sense.
16 projects that we've reviewed and approved. something like that.
I got short-term memory, I'm not,
But a lot of them were the parking in the front yard, but some were, another one that we see a lot of is, we have a maximum building coverage number of 40%, and if you want to go higher than that, you can through an SDP. We've seen a few of those. But it's a interesting, it's a really cool option available.
great tool.
It is a tool, and it's a great meeting because everyone wants to be there, and everyone wants the project to get approved. There's no opposition because it's good for the environment. It's a meeting that we have during the day. And everyone there is positive, and it's a cool experience.
I think Mr. Fox had his hand up first, though.
Well, I'm glad the Sustainable Design Committee came up because I did have a couple of questions related to that. So my understanding is that the committee has not met since 2019.
Where'd you get that number?
The website. That's the last agenda/minutes that was
Okay.
posted.
I think we've met.
The website does technically list a spot as vacant as well. So I wasn't sure if Mr. Tagle had gotten fed up with it and signed off or something.
So hand me that hand me that pad. I'm gonna make a note to update the website.
No worries. No, I appreciate it. So when was the last time the Sustainable Design Committee met?
It's been a year.
It's been at least a year.
Yeah, at least.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So then I do want to voice a concern. I know you just listed the meeting during the day as a good thing. I work a full-time job that's 40 hours. I can't necessarily make it to a midday meeting, if that makes sense. So I don't know, like, because again, everybody involved, like, 3 of them are city employees, so it makes sense you're at the city. I don't know Mr. Tagle, Mr. Hudson's situation specifically, but it
We're
would
private
be.
industry.
I know the boss.
Okay, you guys.
They both do.
So I will say that it does seem like the during the day meeting creates a bit of a barrier.
So great comment or
Yeah.
comment. So the daytime meeting was tailored to the schedule of the 2 planning commission members who happen to be serving now. If there's a different makeup, we can certainly move that to the evening. Not a problem. It just, what we do is, the first thing I do is I ask the applicant, like, what time works for you? They go, anytime, any day, I'm happy to be there. Well, now I know, it saves me a night meeting, it saves them a night meeting, it saves the other 2, so it's like we do it during the day. If one of the members couldn't do it during the day, we do it at night. Or if the applicant wanted to do it at night, we do it at night. It's not etched in stone. The meeting schedule is a case-by-case basis at a time that's convenient for all. So that's not a barrier to anyone serving on the committee.
Fantastic. No, I really appreciate the clarification. Thank you. I just have one other question about the committee. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding it. So the ordinance sets out very specific things that a developer can do, just like a menu they can pick from.
Yes.
A developer can't necessarily come in with something new or potentially innovative. They have to go with what's specifically in the ordinance.
It lists a general standard,
Okay.
but allows the applicant to have flexibility in design within that general standard. So example, stormwater quality, if it improves stormwater quality. But that could be pervious pavement, that could be a rain garden or a bioswale, that could be, there's other things that could be applied for that, to meet that standard. Another thing we don't charge anything for it. There's no fee. So, it's work on our end, we probably should, but it's another incentive.
Okay. I'll let Mr. Pizon help.
Just 2 questions. So when was the project built, the one you just showed, with the EV charging station in the front?
2011?
It says 2011.
That's what I thought it said.
Oh, yeah.
So there was a charging station put in 2011? An EV charging station?
I don't
It
think
just
that was
seems
part of the
early. It just
original
seems early for me.
proposal, but it was an
It
addition.
may not have been part of the original.
Yeah.
It may not have been.
And then the second question, it's a general question. Does the city, I was under the impression that certain cities, I'm thinking of New York City, has like a net zero requirement for buildings. And buildings are being compelled to get to that over some time frame. Do we have anything like that in Troy?
No.
And how does that work in what, Salim, you were saying? I mean, is that an overarching regulation that would have to be put on?
It would, and you would have to incentivize for it, and it would be very costly. I think even platinum level LEED compliance is not necessarily net zero, so it'd be very difficult to achieve that. But I think that
I thought New York was compelling people to get there, which I thought was an issue.
I think that the approximation toward, or the getting closer to net zero is a at a neighborhood to municipality level effort in terms of carbon footprint, rather than individual, in terms of consumption to output. But
So it's the neighborhood level as opposed to a building?
yeah, like Ann Arbor, which I know our consultant Ben actually was using in reference to analyzing because he works in Ann Arbor, their plan as well for Troy has a net zero plan at a municipal level. But for specific developments, there's not necessarily an effort for that, at least not that I've heard of.
So I'm sorry, so there's one in Ann Arbor, you said?
At a municipal level.
At a municipal, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
May I ask another question? Salim, right?
Yep.
Salim, can you tell me, based on the research that you have so far conducted, have you come across the kind of incentives that cities offer? What kind of incentives do they offer for promoting more and more of such projects?
Yeah, the most common type of incentive is a cluster development project, which has a minimization of impact of whatever the area for the development is. That's typically the most common type of incentive. Although there may be implicit incentives that refer to sustainable development practice such as water quality, and there's many ways to reach that compliance they're not as explicit in the way they're defining that incentive. It's more so saying they will be more likely to approve something like a special use permit, for example. Versus Troy has more specific exactions in terms of ratios that are benefiting you in that incentive, meeting compliance with that incentive.
Go ahead.
Well, so let's just say hypothetically, I wanted to pick one of these things that we currently allow but don't incentivize, and I wanted to say, well, can we incentivize it? Would that involve calculating a new type of ratio or equation or something to actually make that, put that in practice?
Can you give me an example?
Let's just say the example of the planter boxes, just to make it easy. You install this many planter boxes, you get something. You know what I'm trying to, how would that incentive actually look in practice, I guess is maybe the question.
Well, I typically think of incentives, you were typically talking about either time or money.
Okay.
Time, because time is money, so if you can, or maybe predictability is another word. So going back to the sustainable development, the SDP as an example, it's not a planter box, but just to.
Sure.
What going before the SDP does for relief of the parking in front of the building, the applicant does have the option to go in front of the zoning board of appeals, but the standards are different. We have to do public hearing notification, that's 6 weeks out. Then you've got the unpredictability of applying the variance standards for the variance versus going in front of the SDP, which the application can be processed, the agenda can be put together in a couple of weeks, so they can get approval within 2 weeks versus 2 months. So, which means they get they can start construction quicker, they can get it completed quicker, they can start making money quicker. So predictability is time, and time is money. So, how incentivizing planter boxes, I don't know about that example, but we could, you could incentivize by saying something like, if you meet this checklist, you don't have to go in front of the planning commission, you go administrative or something. I'm just making something up, but it's, do you have an idea, John?
Well, I have a thought. I mean, if a developer was coming in front of us to try to obtain something that they couldn't, wouldn't they be bringing in what they want to gain by having, hey, if I put in planter boxes, will you allow me to do this? Now, if that's the case, I would be kind of concerned that that the committee would have to make that decision kind of in a silo, because everybody under the sun, if this caught on, would be coming in, and it would almost be on a case-by-case basis. So I think, I don't necessarily think that would be the way to go at it, but I think if we started hearing from the development community, these things are important. They want to be able to get this. I think that could be considered as to maybe expand, the best practices, or to put that in the list, and, if you do this, then this is the benefit from it. But I think, coming in front of the committee kind of cold, and I would be a little concerned with that, because where does that go? It becomes a wild west.
Yeah, you'll see in there, bike racks in there, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so we require a bike rack. Every site plan, you gotta have a bike rack. It's not incentivized, you have to provide it, I can say this, it's not really answering your question, but it's getting to some of the sustainable elements that we're talking about, is I've noticed a pattern every planning commission meeting. One of the planning commissioners, a lot of times it's you, asks a question, what sustainable best management practices are you implementing in this project? And sometimes you hear crickets chirping, because there's no answer, but sometimes they say, well, we're doing this. When we have pre-application meetings, we prime the pump with the applicant. We're like, what's your planning commission like? Well, they're really into quality design. They want to see creative design. You're going to be asked about sustainable elements. You're going to want to think about adding sustainable elements. Like we prime the pump to try to facilitate getting a project that is good for the community, which in other words the planning commission supports. So we're already doing a little bit behind the scenes. It's not incentivization per se,
Sure.
but it's kind of like giving them the answers to the quiz in advance a little bit, and telling them, like, you need to think about putting some things in that are good for the environment, that, be creative, so that we're already doing that now. You don't always see it, but we
To
are.
some degree, the inherent difficulty in sites that are existing for development now implicitly incentivize that, because they're difficult to develop on. So that's just part of the process.
Yeah, all the easy land has been developed. Everything left now is challenging. Every bit of land that we see from this point forward is either a tear down and rebuild, or it's an infill or development of a site that's really challenging for whatever reason. Wetlands, floodplain, contamination, things like that.
If we do the hypothesis of a incentivization and it was financial, where would the money come from?
Let me know when you figure that out.
Thank you, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Okay,
It would be taxes, but it would be a tax reduction, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But I'm just throwing it out there.
Well, and I guess this is just me spitballing off of, the 8 months I've been on planning commission, the things that we kind of keep hearing about over and over again. One of the big ones is parking. And I know we've talked about potentially just changing our parking requirements, potentially eliminating them. Could that be an incentive? Your parking requirement is reduced because you put solar panels on the building. Your parking requirement is reduced because you've put bioswales. I don't know, we leave the parking requirement in for the dirty buildings, but if developers start coming in with greener projects, we tell them they don't have to use as much parking. And that's just a spitball.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, probably, I imagine. So.
Yeah, there are some communities that have reduced parking, or they've allowed for public streets to be used for parking. That's going to need some.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
a little
for
bit
sure.
flat-footed right now. Like,
For
that's going
sure.
to need some discussion and some investigation.
Oh yeah, I just, in my head, just the past couple of meetings that we've had, I mean, goodness, the PUD at Big Beaver and
John
Crooks. I mean, that, parking ended up being a thing where it was me and Mr. Krent, I believe, going back and forth figuring out how to word a parking bank motion. And so my thought is, if we could have said to that developer, like, hey, if half the building was solar powered, then those extra spaces, don't worry about them. But again, I don't know if that'd be really tricky to implement versus, I'm sure that that's probably a whole separate meeting or two in and of itself, but it's just a thought.
Yeah, and I know that you just use those, at least I suspect you use those the solar panels and the parking as just a kind of an example.
Whatever.
I think there's gotta be some type of a nexus between the solar panel and the parking. Like what's the relationship between those two things? But I hear what you're saying, like I get it, the challenge is gonna be, what do you incentivize? What specific elements do you incentivize? How are they related? And how does the outcome justify the incentive?
Go ahead, whoever wants to go next, go ahead.
So just a real specific question. I'm looking at the grid and I see the cluster development, and I know what the incentive is for that.
Yeah.
So like vegetated swales, what's the incentive for that? That's up on the screen right now.
So vegetated swale is a depression in the ground, and it's basically, it serves as
And I'm not asking what it is, I'm asking what the incentive is.
So the incentive would be a swale as an alternative to a more expensive detention basin or underground detention.
Okay, so it's a different form
Different
of
form.
wastewater management or stormwater management.
Yeah, and it would be potentially an
And it's
amenity for the site.
economically, it's
similar to
better.
the bioretention,
Yeah.
rain gardens
And the
impervious.
that's where I was going, okay,
Yeah,
okay,
and raising
okay.
impervious services.
So the incentive is they can
Those are
use
tied
that
together.
instead of, right, okay. thank
So
you.
the incentive.
I think that's to your point of the relation of.
Yeah, I think, so, what happens sometimes when we see some applications for sustainable development, or even for PUDs or some sites, it's not just one of those stormwater elements, it's a combination. So there'll be a swale, there'll be a rain garden, some pervious pavement, as well as a small detention basin, but what that does is the smaller detention basin is less area that's dedicated to detention, which means more developable area, which means more intensity on the site and more building.
Thank you, that's very
So
helpful.
it's,
Yep.
when really creative developers, they start to tick a lot of boxes and do a lot of things on site that add up to one big improvement.
Okay.
Okay, so I was over the summer, I went to Okemos, which is Meridian Township. And one of the things that caught my eye when I was driving by is at their municipal center, which would be like the equivalent of right here, City Hall on Big Beaver, it was lines and lines of solar panels. So I snapped a picture and then I went home and went online and looked. And their goal is to have their city, what I mean is the city buildings, be 100% solar powered by 2035. And then you can go through and you can see all the different things that they've done in the last, I think they started this in 2019, in all the different areas of city buildings that they're going towards that. So first of all, I thought that would be a perfect thing for us because we have that big green yard to do that. But what it does is it really sets an example, and it says that Troy is going green and we are innovative, we're modern, and being green is important. Can we have some conversations about, I have no idea what our role is in this, but it would be nice to see the city taking some initiative and setting the standard of trying to do something like that itself. And then that way, we're representing what we want for the community as well.
So, you watched City Council last night? So September 11th is a special study meeting of City Council to discuss sustainability and to discuss the sustainability plan. I think we've talked about this a little bit about being interested at the City Council level. Mr. Fox asked the question last meeting. It was asked in such a way that I didn't understand the question. as we left, I walked out of the hallway, I'm like, did you mean an EECBG grant, the EECBG program? He said, I think that's what it was. So the city has applied for an EECBG grant. Again, this is related to sustainable development, sustainable planning. We've been earmarked for a $190,000 grant. We're going to formally apply in January. We're going to use the money to create a strategic plan for sustainability. I know just enough to be dangerous right now, so no follow-up questions, please. But we're also going to be joining an organization called the Michigan Green Community Challenge, which is administered through MML. So there's some wheels spinning in the background here, and we're kind of at the starting point of something, I think. I did mention to the assistant city manager today, remind her that the planning commission is interested in having a dialogue with the city council in a joint meeting. And just a friendly reminder, she remembered that's something that's been kind of informally requested, but we'll be able to further that goal after we can pass a special meeting. We apply for the EECBG grant. Probably in the new year, we'll be looking to schedule a joint meeting. So there's traction here.
Good.
John, you have a question? Sure, okay.
I want to piggyback on what Ms. Braga said. The new project that we have, the ice pavilion here, I don't remember, but correct me if I'm wrong, I'm forgetting, do we have any such kind of sustainable development pockets within that? Are we doing something? So that would be the first way that we could showcase that we as a city are future thinking forward.
I wish I'd known this question beforehand. I would have. What I'd like to do, I don't want to misspeak. I believe there's some element. I think there's some. I don't want to speak off the cuff, but I think there's a lot of native plant species. The building is developed in such a way with a lot of natural light. I could go on, but I'd rather defer to Kurt Bovensteep and the project architect from OHM and get them to respond. And what I'd like to do is follow up with an email with an outline of everything now.
That would be helpful, because that would that's the newest one that we are doing, and one that will set the tone for what the city would want to do or would like to do in the future. I'd like to see something, come out that way, and advertised too, marketed, advertised, heavily mentioned wherever needed.
And I think I've mentioned this before, but we when you look at the list, like, we fare pretty well with our neighbors. And so we do, is there work to be done? Absolutely. We could do better. No question we could do better. We fare pretty well, but what we don't do very well is tell our story. We don't do that well at all. Like, I know that DPW has like hybrid cars in their fleet. There's all kinds of best management things that all the departments do. Like, this is a best management practice. We don't send you paper. This saves. I did the math one year. This saves, I forget how many reams of paper every year, as an example.
But like the report in general.
We process applications with a program called BSNA electronically. The building department doesn't require paper, so as an example. So if all the departments sat and put together a list, it would be pretty impressive. We don't do a very good job of informing people of what we do.
Building department just obtained hybrid fleet as well.
As a follow-up to that too, I know out in the hallway, the Troy Public Library has a survey that they're conducting, and potentially there might be a future library building, depending on finances and what the public thinks, but that's an opportunity to give feedback on, we want to make sure a new library building, if it's built, is green friendly, so.
I just took that survey today, and that's another example of an important building. I mean, I think the other comment, I guess, and I don't think it's up to us, but it would be nice if City Council would approve perhaps investing in a consultant to provide us with a plan of how to do it and the steps to take to get where we want to go. Because I think that none of us, I'm not an expert, a lot of us in this room are not an expert on this, nor city council members. So to really take it seriously, and I get we're taking a lot of steps, but I don't know, I think we could do more.
Yeah, and I think that the EECBG grant, what they're looking to do is to do a strategic plan to address some of your concerns.
So one question, going back to the report that I remember seeing you get scroll through on the screen. So in Royal Oak, they require you to build vegetated roofs? And vegetated swales?
That might be a issue with the coloring as well, sorry about that.
Okay,
Yeah, they, to my knowledge, don't require vegetated roofs.
they don't require, okay.
That may be an attempt to place it as incentivized. It would make sense in terms of the coloration. I do remember them having language relating to vegetated roofs. That was incentivized base.
I do recall, John, help me out on this, if you remember, the city of Chicago got very, very aggressive with requiring vegetated roofs. Do you remember reading about that?
I don't.
Okay. Yeah, because of the heat island effect,
Yeah,
it was every building, now I think maybe it was of a certain height or a certain square footage, required a vegetated roof to ward off the effects of the heat island effect.
well, so I guess that kind of segues into a follow-up question. Are there situations where, and this is potentially where we could get into it with ordinances specifically, could we hypothetically say like, oh, you're building a multifamily unit that goes over so many stories, you need a vegetated roof? Like, is that something that the city would be able to put in as more of a requirement than an incentive? Because I know we've talked about incentives, but kind of segueing into requirements.
So, yeah, that would, again, go over the minimum requirements set by the building code. So we couldn't
Okay.
put stricter requirements.
You know, in our Sustainable Development Committee, we had a building being remodeled, I think, in an industrial district. And they voluntarily put in on the roof a huge reflective coating to reflect the sun. And did that in their own, but that was certainly helpful in sustainable development.
Yeah, a lot of incentivization language in the ZODAs that are more recent would be relating to EV ready, solar ready language, because they're not necessarily structural elements that are regulated within the building code, and it's not necessarily placing a requirement to install them, but it's lower cost on them, but it's longer term benefit because putting in a conduit is not the same as putting in the installation itself, but then it makes it easier if there's another tenant or another owner that wants to create that image, it makes it easier for them to place those installations in the future. So that's a pretty common practice.
We're talking about a lot of things that cross over between what the ordinance can incentivize and what the Michigan Energy Code requires and the Michigan Building Code requires. Incentivizing something where a developer would step up and say, yes, I want to get this, so I will do this even though it exceeds the minimum requirements of the Energy Code or the Building Code. But I don't think we could put in requirements that would exceed, like JR is saying, like would exceed what the state codes require them to do. The other thing that I've seen over the years, regions, geographic regions play a big role in how communities actually embrace, or to what degree communities and developers embrace green design or sustainable design. If you go out to the West Coast, they're all over it out there. I mean, West Coast of the United States. If you go out to the West Coast of Michigan, you see more of that desire to fulfill that sustainability checkbox than you do here. Tell me why. I don't know. I don't know. We've talked about this, that how can we incentivize the local folks on this side to be more willing to look at opportunities and things like that. I don't know why. I mean, I think the incentivized road is the only way to go, but I don't know if the incentives are enough, to actually get them to commit to that. Because you're right, it comes down to dollars, it comes down to time. And the other aspect of it is, depending on whose project it is, if it's a national corporation or an international corporation and they're part of their pitch to their clients, we're sustainable. They're going to be the ones that are going to invest in sustainability. There are a lot of companies, for a lot of reasons, that just don't follow that path. They'll meet the minimum requirements, which are better than they were yesterday. They're not as good as maybe they could be someday. So there's a lot of different elements in these discussions that, for a planning commission and a zoning ordinance, we have limitations. Not to say that as a community or as a city, we shouldn't be beating the drum and showing the community, and not only telling them, but what benefit is it to the community?
Mm-hmm.
What benefit is to me reading that you guys are using EVs, or you don't send out paper anymore, we do so it's got to be more than just telling the story. It's got to be what's the benefit to this community. So, anyways.
Yeah, it's less paper in the landfill, it's less taxpayer dollars spent on this, it's,
Now you're hitting me. Less tech.
Yeah, there's
That's the
one.
word you said. But I mean, that's the point.
right.
I mean, the taxpayer will look at it and say, yeah, so what? Wow, how does it affect me? Why should I stand up and say rah, rah? I mean, there are some that'll just, they're behind it, they believe in it, and they'll go for it. But there's others that have to be convinced that this is important and there's value.
There's LEED neighborhood level compliance, which could have incentive in terms of property value, for example. That's just an example that came to mind.
What Mr. Tagle just now mentioned, I am thinking behind, may not be a very good example, but I'm thinking it's like the stores, the retail stores or the big box stores, going the route of not having plastic bags in their stores, as opposed to ones who have moved on to having no bags or paper bags. What's the incentive for, say, a company like Walmart to do that? I agree. It's hard to convince the developers as much as it is hard to convince the retailers in going that route. So I can definitely draw parallels to both. But I'm just gonna, my curiosity perked after Brent's comment that he made. I'm just gonna go back to a conversation that you and I had. It was a while ago, so if you don't remember, that's perfectly fine. But this was after we had our Michigan Planning Association conference online. And one of the ones that I happened to watch later on happened to be about the city of Rochester. And I don't distinctly remember who the consulting group is for that city of Rochester, but when any project comes in front of the city of Rochester's Planning Commission, even before it gets to the table, of course, they had a point scheme that they followed. Are you familiar, Salim, with
They
that?
have a grid scheme that they use to
Yes.
measure the level of low impact development that although it's not a set of requirements, they use it as a measure.
Yes, and you have to hit a minimum score, so say 20, in order to even have the project even move to the table on the agenda, okay? I was just thinking about all that when Tyler brought up the incentives and the discussion. If something like this can be worded into hours and say, okay, how many of these do you check? Or which 3 are you planning to address? Something where we say, oh, okay, it's actually on the checklist here. So if we don't check even 1, will the Planning Commission approve? Or if I check 3, I have more potential for it to be on the agenda and quite possibly get passed. Is that some kind of a thing that we can do?
I remember having the conversation with you.
Okay, good.
Are you listening to this? I see you doodling, I want to make sure you're.
I'm writing grid scheme, I'm getting notes.
Because you may
Why
have.
is this pick on Julie Day?
No, no,
I'm
no,
leaving
no.
again.
No, because you may have to chime in here.
Paper?
So, I think the approach is really innovative, and I especially like the approach if the point system gives a lot of flexibility, a lot of options to choose from. But what do you think about this, Julie? If there's standards, minimum standard, so we create a list with a point
I think we'd be surprised at
system?
the number of things that are already gonna get checked. I don't think it changes. I don't think it moves the needle at all.
Well, I think, but there's some elements that maybe are.
It'll make us feel better for seeing a checklist of things checked off that the developers are already doing. There, that's my opinion.
I think you're right. I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that
Because we can't add things, right?
Yeah, this
Right,
is
to Celine's point.
No, I know.
Well,
That's what I'm saying.
That's what I'm getting at is this is a minimum requirement to get on the agenda for planning commission. You've got to meet a benchmark of so many points. So from a zoning perspective, from a legal perspective, if this is applied under zoning, it's going to have to be across the board for all projects. There's going to have to be a governmental interest for doing this. We're going to have to be able to justify doing it. I mean, what do you think, assuming that some of these projects are not things we already do, they're more expensive, they're more difficult to obtain. From a zoning perspective, is this something that we can look at?
It's definitely something we can look at, but my point is, it's depending on what that list is, and I have seen Rochester's sheet. I mean, depending on what those things are, I
Yeah.
think they're going to meet that minimum. It's not that hard to meet the minimum.
But what does that mean? I've met the minimum. If I don't meet the minimum, do I get a no? Do I not even get to
You
the
don't get
planning
to, you
commission?
don't get on the agenda.
So it's a requirement of the ordinance that you must get a minimum score out from this list.
How does that not violate this thing that we're talking about that you can't,
Because there are probably already things that are required in the building code.
It could be things like provide a bike rack, which we require, provide
so we're just
parking lot
pulling it
trees.
out of our zoning ordinance and putting it in a grid?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be put a green roof on.
You know, I have a problem with
Why put a
closing the
vegetative
door
roof on your?
before it's open.
Yeah.
Everybody in the city of Troy has an opportunity to be heard with its various city departments. With this planning commission, if we had a grid and it was a 0, we said, well, you can't even come in. We said, well, let me tell you why it's a 0. There are some good reasons why. I just think it's bad policy.
In general, if you have a requirement on a grid system like that, there's probably a rational justification between that being a requirement versus an incentive. Otherwise, there could be a reason to push back that's justified. So if you were to implement one, you'd have to make sure that any requirements you're placing, like for example with the idea of the solar on the roof and the parking requirement, a rational relation between that as a requirement versus just an incentive. And in that case, there wasn't one, so that's why you would do it as an incentive versus a requirement.
I remember looking at the list, we had this conversation a couple years ago, I remember looking at the list, but I don't remember exactly what the elements were that were on the list and how easy they were to obtain. My question was more so, what if the elements were a little bit more difficult? Because I mean, you all know this, we require a 1 parking lot tree for every 8 spaces. We have developers every meeting saying, well, I don't want, if I put a parking lot tree in, I'm gonna lose a parking space. Well, yeah, but you're also gonna provide shade and reduce the heat island effect. Well, can I put it on can I put it outside? We get that every meeting. You know, every meeting. So that, we get pushback on a parking lot tree. We're gonna get more pushback when we say, well, if you get 3 points if you put a green roof over the, you know. Sure. You know what I mean?
The non-structural elements within these best management practices are zoning ordinance regulated, have more possibilities to be requirements versus incentives. Anything that's structurally associated would be more along the incentive line.
Let me approach it from maybe a little different direction. First, Celine did a great job here with this grid, and when I look at it, I say, well, Troy's doing a pretty good job compared to our neighboring communities. Doesn't mean we can't do more, but are there any of the, in the column there where it has the green indicated that it's permitted, are there any of those that we could possibly look at to change to incentives? I mean, for example, when we say a vegetated roof, can we say, is there an incentive we could offer for a developer to put a vegetated roof in? Or is there any that could be easily dealt with? I mean, you know, the low-hanging fruit that we could approach.
So when we talk about incentives, we have to determine what that incentive is gonna be, time or money.
Yeah.
So, you know, what, density bonus for, you know, if it's a residential density bonus, is more units per acre? You know, that's an incentive.
Yeah.
It works for cluster, but now we're getting, now we're, the D word, density, right?
It's a good example. That's a good example you put out there.
Yeah.
To incentivize something, there's gotta
Gotta
be,
make it worthwhile.
gotta make it worthwhile. So whatever that, I don't know, I don't have the answer.
I'm just saying, but
Yeah.
are there any that are really, would be really easy to look at doing, so.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily shy away from the idea of creating a bit more density. I mean, we heard a developer the other day say that when they were required to increase their lot sizes, the average pricing of their house went up. So by offering incentives where you can get more density in a single section of land, not only could we be getting greener builds, but also builds that are potentially more affordable because they're not massive houses.
You're gonna have a political issue coming up.
Yeah, careful what you.
I can just
Density is a bad word.
imagine city council saying, okay, we're gonna do like California, if your lot's a certain size, you can put 3 more buildings on it, whether your neighbor likes it or not. I think that's dead in the water.
Yeah. You're looking for pitchforks and torches.
From residents or from council?
Residents.
Residents.
From residents.
Yep, absolutely.
Which means council as well.
Yes. Another question, the Sustainable Development Committee. It seems like not enough businesses are really taking advantage of that. With the new, the new communications and engagement person on staff. I know she probably has a pretty full agenda right now, but is that one thing where she can really promote and say the city of Troy is encouraging more businesses to come and apply for sustainable development standards?
So she would absolutely be willing to help us with that. No, and we could message that and get it out there that it's an option. I'm gonna lean on John a little bit here. So most of the SDP projects, as I indicated, are parking in front of the building. Most of our buildings are about 50 feet from the street or less. Actually, it's 30 feet setback. So we're for most of these parking lots that are in front of the building, we're talking about usually 4 parking spaces or 6, right? There's a center drive, 3 spaces on one side, 3 spaces on the other side, 6 spaces. The site still has to be designed by a civil engineer. So the civil engineering fee to do those plans is, I don't know, anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000, plus or minus, right? Or it's an architect it's part of a building. So there's a charge for that. We don't charge a fee, but you have to pay the professionals. You got to pay the project. You've got to do all the infrastructure. So for 6 spaces, it's still expensive. It's still relatively expensive for 6 parking spaces. What's the incentive? Well, for some, they need the parking because they expanded the building or whatever. But for some, like John said, they don't need the parking. What they want is they want that image enhancement. They want to be able to market the building or recruit employees. Some employees, they want to know, they want a comfortable workspace. They want clean, fresh air. They want a nice break room. They want high ceilings and they want low VOC paint. I mean, am I right? You know, they want low VOC carpet. They want all these things. So they're willing to pay that price. So we can certainly get the word out, but at the end of the day, you still have to. It's still expensive, and you still have to have someone willing. There has to be something in it for them. But if developers don't know the program's there, you know, we can certainly. I think that's a great idea. We can certainly trumpet it better.
What we need is at a legislative level that kind of, take brownfield redevelopment, for example. Brownfield redevelopment is incentivized by, captured tax funds, money the city pays for it, whatever. The state needs to legislate something that incentivizes sustainable development projects. So it can't come from the city, because like Mr. Buechner pointed out, who's gonna pay for it? We don't have any money. But if there was some sort of incentive like brownfield redevelopment related to sustainable development, that would open up this area immensely. So that's where I think our efforts need to be, is at the state legislature. Talk to your representatives about doing something at the state level. There's very little that we can do.
Brownfield was brought up, and I don't remember the exact details, but where my businesses are, that was included in it as someone that was needed in a nice area of Troy. So there's so many details in there that get really tricky. And guys, it all comes down to money.
Right.
Everything is money.
Yeah.
I try to keep an open mind in everything I do, and this subject as well. I talk to people for a living, and I've really tried to dive into this to see how can we do this, what's the best way. I have great friends that are builders, and they've said this is all about, every one of those items is expensive. And I've researched them myself. I don't know that my business would have gotten off the ground if I would have had to go with some of that. I really don't know if I could have made it. I really don't. And I've had big builders and smaller builders and residential, commercial come to me. We've talked about this. It all comes down to money. It's expensive. And I'm going to want to keep it open mind. We want to go after this. This is a high priority, I think, for everybody in the room. But we got to look at all sides of this because it's important.
It's not only is it money though, but it also takes creativity. And we at this table have talked many times about the lack of creativity from the development community in this area. I mean, yes, it's about money, but developers, they can get creative with some of their solutions if they were incentivized to do some of these things.
Like we have talked about how Troy is really built out, and so we're gonna start seeing a lot of repurposing of buildings, and that is, an effort to be green. It checks a box, as somebody told us when they came in and you asked the question, and they're like, well, I'm repurposing the building, I just checked the box there. Fair enough, but those are the types of things that we can focus on incentivizing, so we are doing it right when they're converting buildings and repurposing and.
And quick plug, reminder, I send everyone an email. Wednesday, August 30th at 10 a.m.
Oh yeah, I registered for that.
We'll talk about a best management practice, which is repurposing office buildings into residential. And I hear they have this brilliant speaker.
Speaking of that, friends.
Subject matter expert, right?
Art Miller?
Well, I guess along that topic, that was one random thing I wanted to inquire about in terms of the conversions from office into potentially other options. Is there a lot of zoning that actually allows for that type of transition where both offices and apartments can be in the same spot? Because I'm remembering our developer from last meeting where they were building an office building, but I know that was Big Beaver, which is kind of a weird district, but like they had no option other than to put an office building there.
Yes, the vertical mixed use is permitted in OM, it's permitted in Big Beaver, Maple Road, theoretically the nodes. It's
Rochester? Rochester's a big one, right, business-wise?
Yeah, but the in terms of the zoning that allows it, GB and CB
Yeah.
don't allow it. But we've got, I don't know what percentage of the city, but quite a few buildings would be able to be renovated. A lot of, and most of the large office buildings that could be, appropriate for that conversion, it would be permitted.
Well, and so when an office building converts to a residential building, we require currently more parking for residential buildings than office buildings, is that correct?
No.
No, is it?
Significantly less.
Significantly less for
Significantly less.
residential or for
Yes.
office? Okay,
Significantly less.
so they're often gonna be overparked if they make that transition.
Yeah, and I don't want to give away my presentation next Wednesday.
Sure.
We're not coming.
For the two projects that were recently renovated, one on Crooks and one on Kurtz, it's expensive to renovate a building. I mean, John knows this. Per square foot, it's very expensive. But if you get a building for pennies on the dollar, 50 cents on the dollar, because it's a stranded asset, it's just sitting there, and the bank doesn't know what to do with it. So a developer is able to purchase that at a really good price. They look at the parking lot, the empty parking lot that was overparked because it was built in the 70s when we had huge parking requirements. That's the farmer's field now. The farmer's fields are gone, but we have big parking lots. So maybe it's a wash, whether they demo the building or renovate the building. Maybe it's a wash for the but they pick it up for a song, so now it makes it viable. But they can also have the development potential of that parking lot. So we get the density on the parking lot. Another bonus is most of these aren't really close to single-family residential neighborhoods, right? The big offices typically aren't. So there's not a lot of neighbors that are impacted by the additional infill. So it's kind of it's a win-win, right? As well as keeping all that waste, all that carbon out of the landfill.
Like the Lindsay Center was the
Yeah,
perfect
the Lindsay
example
Center.
where they
Yeah.
built a
Exactly.
second building in the parking lot.
Exactly.
Is that potentially an avenue we could look at for incentives, trying to incentivize those types of builds?
Well,
Or are
the-
they all happening anyway?
The incentive is there because of the parking lot.
Okay.
And because if you remember the Kurtz was by right, it was one meeting, one planning commission meeting approved. So that it gets time and money, right? The time was by right, one meeting.
Yeah, and part of the ECGB, potential uses would be like energy auditing for retrofitting, for example. And that would give a baseline for for people that are interested in that kind of development, the value of a building. Also in terms of long-term return of interest, which everything's about money, in terms of energy savings for converting that building versus another. And that would provide value in terms of to developers, identifying those specific buildings that have that value.
Like for a green roof, or look at something like an insulation, like really, really high-end insulation. The person spends the money on the high-end insulation so they can recoup that money over time. Well, if the payback is, they do the math, it's 200 years, well, the building's probably not even gonna be there in 200 years. So, but if the payback is 5 years or 10 years, and they plan to be there for at least 20 years, now we're talking, now there's an incentive to do that. So, like Toby said, it boils down to money. And, if there's money to be made, then it's something you'd think about.
I did a payback on solar, it was 90 years, with incentive from the government. And I did payback I got all the data, guys, and LED lighting, it paid back in like 4 years. I did all my buildings in LED lighting because it paid for itself.
Yeah.
And back to Walmart bags, that's why they do it, it's to save the money, it's all about. They do the studies to figure it out. If we get a less profitable building for them, give it less money that they pay, they're gonna wanna make more profit on it. That's what businesses do, right or wrong, because if they don't make a profit, they go under. So just gave you a couple of examples that are real world ones that you just mentioned.
I only put this item on the agenda because I knew that there was going to be a lot of dialogue. So this is, and I don't think we're going to solve all our problems related to sustainability tonight, but it's good food for thought, and it's a really good starting point.
One more thought. As Mr. Tagle rightly pointed, geography dictates many of our ordinances. But now with all this happening in terms of the weather and the climate that is so drastically changing and impacting, I'm just curious how the states in the western half of the United States are able to be so proactive on this end. And their ordinances allow, their building codes are so much more stricter, especially with wildfire. They are not allowing certain materials to be used in residential/commercial construction. In fact, I recently heard in Colorado, many areas, the residences are not encouraged to put a fire pit or have a campfire in the backyard because of the fire threat. Again, so they're able to do, or rather get away with so many of these positive ones. But here, as I understand the developers have to come up with that idea. They have to be creative. They have to think about all these things. But it seems like some of those cities are really so far ahead. And Chicago has turned so much green. The downtown Chicago, I was there over the July 4th weekend, compared to what I visited that city about 10, 12 years back to now. It's a lot greener today. It was a happy sight to see for an urban pocket to going that in that trend with green. And there are so many buildings, commercial buildings, banks especially, which have green roof or green walls, green spaces within. Their lobby areas are greener. We would love to see something like that happen on this side of the lake as well.
I think some of that is ordinance though, too,
Yeah.
isn't it? And it's
Yeah.
the will of the people in
Yes.
those communities.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I mean,
And they impose it on the business people. Yeah.
truth be told, even their HOAs are pretty strict on so many things that they allow or not allow. Whether it is weather related or climate related or geography dictating those decisions, it's there. They do limit quite a bit in some instances.
So, sorry, just to piggyback off what
Sure.
you were saying, is that like a unique to Michigan issue, the whole we cannot go above and beyond? So then I guess, do you guys happen to be aware how these other cities are going above and beyond?
I mean, Chicago's a very high density city. There's a lot of financial incentives there. Like the other example was New York. So like there is a difference there. I know Michigan has some good examples in Ann Arbor, Lansing, Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, because they're higher density population areas that have greater financial incentives. But so there's some correlation there between the examples being given. Now, if you were to go to some of the less urban areas within those states, you'd probably find that Troy's, performing very well. So it's just kind of the context that you're providing for it. At the same time, Michigan does have a unique problem in terms of the amount of water and the climate. So, like for example, the low impact development report that was funded with the EPA to be able to produce this examples of best managing practices, they give ratings that are related to, for example, how well they perform in winter, which is a unique challenge to Michigan. They did studies that are related to the context of Michigan that I'm not sure with other states that would be require more research.
Good answer. I will say one thing too, I think city staff has definitely evolved over the years, because I can remember a former assistant city manager stating that low impact development wouldn't work in Troy because we have too much clay in our soil. So obviously you guys have learned a lot and developed significantly to be much more appreciative of low impact development and sustainability. So he shall remain nameless. He doesn't work here anymore. So. Anything else that you had to share with us?
No, again, this is a starting point and get people thinking and keep moving forward.
And then you mentioned the consultant or the dollars, and there'll be a plan, or working toward a plan.
Yeah, so what I can do is, I'll report back after the special meeting on 9/11. I don't even want to say those words. On September, the 11th of September, and give you an update on where we're at, and so we're informed.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you to Salim and to city staff in general for, I imagine this was a lot of footwork and a lot of work to put this all together. So thank you very much for all the preparations and everything that went into all this. And I appreciate that we got started on talking about a lot of these issues. I think it's the more conversations that are had, the better. So I appreciate that we took some time to go over all this stuff today.
Yeah, Salim, you definitely did an outstanding job, I must say.
It was all him.
Yeah, and it's good to do this research. It kind of helps us think and kind of understand all the other aspects, because I may be just wearing my blinders here and thinking this way, but you have given us a little bit more food to chew on with other dimensions that you've presented. So I thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Any more questions? If not, then we will move on to public comment for items on the agenda. No one from the public is here, so we can move along to planning commission comment. We'll start here and work our way around.
I'm all set, thank you.
I was just looking at this chart and protecting riparian buffer areas, X. But we've got the Rouge River running through the city complex. And I think the city's done a nice job. They have prevented the geese from polluting the river by letting the natural vegetation come up. And I think they've got some concerns about that. They didn't need an ordinance to do it, though. So, the volunteer work, I think, is appreciated.
I want to echo the comments about Salim and staff. I thought it was a great presentation, a lot of data, but also you were able to make it concise and get to some really key issues that helped me understand some of the constraints. So appreciate it.
Yeah, I loved your tables. They really make it simple to understand and compare. Nicely done. And also on the Michigan Association of Planning, our gathering is 2 days from tonight, and it's going to be at the Northern Lights Lounge in Detroit. So if any of you planning commissioners want a night out and talk with other commissioners around the metro area, it's sitting there waiting for you.
I wish I could make it, but unfortunately I'm busy on Thursday. No comment.
No comment, thanks.
I have none, thank you.
Well said.
All set.
Last night, the city council approved the release of the master plan for the 63-day review period. They had one slight revision. They amended the draft future land use plan to lower the Big Beaver classification between Alpine and McClure, to lower it a little bit to the south with that, and also add a brief one-sentence description. With that, it will be released for public review. The Planning Commission will see it again in no less than 63 days. And we're going to send out notification, I think this week, inform neighboring communities, SEMCOG, Oakland County, et cetera, and we'll get any comments that we receive will be provided to the Planning Commission for consideration.
I'll just say, I have a few extra notes that were beyond the review of the resolution, so if you're interested, I can send you those. But that's it.
I'm a planner. How far do we have dates for these meetings? Do we have them through?
For these meetings,
Is it through the 2023?
it's through the end of this year.
Can I ask if we can get it for 24?
We typically approve that in December.
Okay.
If you'd like.
I'm gonna
we
be
can-
traveling sometime, so.
But the bylaws require it to be the second and
Oh,
fourth Tuesday of every month.
Okay, so it's just
We
September.
can amend that if we have to, like
Okay.
around Thanksgiving, we've amended it, but generally you can count on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month.
Thank you.
Typically, the months that have exceptions are sometimes elections cause us to, Thanksgiving or Christmas.
Okay.
Or sometimes don't line up very well, but generally speaking, second or fourth
Thank
Tuesday.
you. Thank you.
The only thing I wanted to mention is, can we get nameplates for, like, there's 3 commissioners here. We still don't have nameplates. So Toby, Lakshmi, and Tyler, I think, don't have
Me, Lakshmi.
nameplates yet, so.
Yeah. The newbies.
And-
Yes.
And the most important thing is that we want to make sure that if Toby wants to build another building that puts a shower in it, we don't want to make him pay for too much money for putting a shower in because it's green friendly.
I didn't understand that one.
It just might depend on the water usage. and water
Yeah,
quality.
well, like that's what they said.
And with that,
Very
we're
nice.
adjourned.
Thank you.